A killer doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they wear a uniform. They stand by your bedside, hold your hand, and promise to make you well. But they have a dark secret. They aren't there to heal you. They're there to kill you. This is the story of the Angels of Death. Her patients called her Jolly Jane. They had no idea her favorite part of the job was watching them die. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jane Toppan appeared to be the picture of professionalism and compassion. She was a nurse working in Massachusetts, known for her gentle demeanor and apparent care for her patients. She moved through her career with ease, gaining the trust of her supervisors and colleagues. Toppan's success in the medical field wasn't unusual at the time. Nurses were revered figures in society, tasked with caring for the sick, administering medications, and often playing a role akin to a caregiver in the family. She fit this role perfectly, as she was described by many as a competent and even heroic figure in her field. But beneath the surface of her calm, professional exterior was a deadly secret. Jane Toppan wasn't just a nurse. She was a killer, one who would go on to claim the lives of at least 31 victims, with suspicions that the real number could be far higher. As she worked in several hospitals and private homes, her seemingly innocent role allowed her access to vulnerable patients, often in their final moments. But while most nurses gave their patients comfort, Toppan found a twisted pleasure in their suffering. Her patients' deaths were not mistakes or accidents. Toppan planned them, orchestrating their deaths with a cold, calculated precision. The first known victim in Toppan's killing spree was a woman named Auntie. She was an elderly relative of one of Toppan's acquaintances, someone who trusted Jane to care for her. The woman, fragile and bedridden, was in need of a nurse to tend to her during a medical crisis. Jane used her position to manipulate the situation, giving her the lethal dose that would kill her, though it appeared to be a natural death. Toppan's ability to hide her actions was striking. She had the medical knowledge to make the cause of death appear plausible. Most victims, especially the elderly and sick, were often written off as dying from old age or illness. For Toppan, this was just the beginning. What made the first killing particularly chilling was the fact that Toppan enjoyed the act. She didn't just kill her patients, she took pleasure in the process. She derived a sick thrill from watching them die. Toppan later admitted that she felt sexually excited by the deaths she caused. The control she exerted over her victims, combined with the intimate nature of her care, created a sense of power for her. This sexual gratification from death became a driving force in her ongoing killings. As Jane Toppan continued her work, the bodies began to pile up, though they went largely unnoticed. The hospitals where she worked were plagued by unexplained deaths, but at the time, no one suspected the nurse who was entrusted with so many lives. Toppan's ability to cover her tracks was remarkable. She administered poison to her victims, often using morphine and atropine, which induced respiratory failure and death. The medical community at the time lacked the forensic tools needed to properly investigate suspicious deaths, and the pattern of deaths was dismissed as natural or unexplainable. For years, Toppan continued her killing spree, methodically eliminating those under her care. The victims ranged from the elderly to young children, each death carefully calculated to avoid suspicion. Her status as a nurse and the trust she commanded in her profession allowed her to move freely through her victims' lives without raising any red flags. Meanwhile, the hospitals where she worked continued to lose patients, but the deaths were written off as unfortunate outcomes of the illnesses they were already suffering from. It wasn't until her arrest that the full extent of Jane Toppan's psychological state was revealed. Toppan confessed to having killed at least 31 people, though experts believe the actual number could be much higher. What shocked the public the most was her motive. While many serial killers are driven by a need for money or revenge, Toppan's reason was far more disturbing. She didn't kill for gain or to settle a score. Instead, she killed because of the rush it gave her. Toppan admitted that she experienced sexual pleasure from watching her patients die, a revelation that left investigators and the public horrified. Toppan's confession was chilling, as she described the way she would inject her victims with lethal doses of drugs while observing their slow decline. She watched, sometimes with fascination, as they struggled for life. The longer it took for them to die, the more pleasure she derived from the act. This psychological profile of a killer is one of the most disturbing in history, as it shows a complete lack of empathy and a warped need for control and excitement. In 1901, after the suspicious death of her foster sister, Toppan's true nature was finally uncovered. Police began investigating her after the family became suspicious of her role in the deaths. Toppan was arrested, and during the investigation, the full scale of her crimes began to surface. The authorities soon realized that she had been systematically killing patients for years, taking advantage of the position of trust that nursing provided her. When she was confronted with the evidence, Toppan showed little remorse. She admitted to the killings, though she claimed that she had no remorse for what she had done. Her case stunned the public, and the legal system was faced with a dilemma. How do you punish someone who not only killed, but found a twisted pleasure in taking the lives of others? Toppan was eventually declared insane and was committed to a mental asylum, where she spent the rest of her life. She was never formally executed, and the full extent of her crimes has left many unanswered questions. How many more victims were there? Could her killings have been stopped earlier if someone had suspected her actions sooner? These questions linger unanswered in the aftermath of her trial. Despite her capture, the case of Jane Toppan serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can exist within the most trusted professions. It's hard to imagine how someone who was supposed to heal could commit such horrific acts, but Toppan's case demonstrates the terrifying reality that evil can often hide in plain sight. Jane Toppan's legacy is one of fear and disbelief. As one of the most prolific female serial killers in U.S. history, her case shocked the nation and left an indelible mark on the medical community. Her ability to gain the trust of those around her, coupled with the lack of oversight in the healthcare system, allowed her to continue her killing spree for years. Today, her story serves as both a warning and a haunting example of how evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. Her case remains one of the most chilling in the annals of true crime, offering a glimpse into the dark psychology of a killer who was, on the outside, nothing more than a trusted healthcare professional. And for those who worked with her or trusted her care, the horror of her actions still echoes in the corridors of history. Toppan killed for a twisted sense of pleasure. But our next killer was driven by something far more common, yet equally disturbing: a need for attention. In a Texas hospital, she turned her young patients' beds into a stage for a deadly act. A parent's worst nightmare isn't a heart monitor that goes silent. It's the nurse who made it happen. Genene Jones was a nurse working in the neonatal and pediatric units of hospitals in Texas. To the outside world, She appeared to be the epitome of what every parent would want in a caregiver for their child: compassionate, skilled, and dedicated to her work. She was praised for her ability to save children from the brink of death, and her colleagues often spoke of her like a hero, a nurse who would go above and beyond to make sure her young patients survived. But behind this image of a devoted healthcare professional was a killer whose actions would haunt the Texas medical community for years to come. Genene worked with infants and children, and it was in these vulnerable patients that she would commit her heinous crimes. It wasn't that she killed her patients outright. Rather, she would induce medical crises, emergencies that would leave the babies and young children fighting for their lives. And just when their lives seemed to be hanging by a thread, Genene would be there to save them, earning the praise and admiration of her colleagues. To the world, she was a hero, but to those closest to her patients, the truth was far darker. Genene Jones's first victims were infants who came under her care in the hospital's neonatal unit. These babies, many of whom were already critically ill, were already in a vulnerable state. But rather than being a stabilizing force, Genene took it upon herself to make sure their condition deteriorated. She used various methods, including injecting them with powerful drugs, such as digoxin or heparin, to intentionally induce medical crises. When a child's condition worsened, she would rush to their side, administering life-saving interventions, and the parents would watch in awe as she saved their child. In many cases, these infants were too young and too fragile to survive, even with intervention. But Genene, acting in her role as the hero nurse, would often resuscitate them just before it was too late, garnering the admiration of her peers. Parents would praise her for being there in their darkest hour, blissfully unaware of the dangerous games she was playing with their children's lives. Genene's actions were initially overlooked as tragic incidents or just part of the job. In a pediatric ward where sick children were bound to die. But as the number of miracle saves grew, so did the suspicions of a few attentive staff members. As the years went on, the death toll in Genene's care began to rise. Infants and young children under her watch seemed to develop sudden and unexplained medical emergencies, crises that would often result in life-threatening conditions. What was even more chilling was that each time one of her patients appeared on the verge of death, Jones would be there, always quick to step in with interventions that seemed almost too perfect. Hospital administrators and staff began to notice an alarming pattern. Babies who were placed under Genene's care often experienced unexplained cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, or other severe complications. Despite this, the doctors and staff at the time were slow to act. The culture within the hospital was one of trust. Trust in the medical professionals, trust in the nurses, and trust in the system itself. By the time Jones's actions were noticed, it was far too late. She had already caused the deaths of at least 60 infants and children, though the exact number remains uncertain. Genene's pattern was disturbingly clear. She would induce crises, often through lethal injections, and then rush in as the hero to revive her patients, basking in the attention she received for saving their lives. When the truth about Genene Jones's crimes came to light, it was almost too disturbing to comprehend. Genene wasn't motivated by financial gain or revenge. Instead, she derived a perverse pleasure from the attention she received for saving her patients. To her, inducing medical emergencies in her young victims and then reviving them made her feel powerful and admired. She was the hero, the one who could snatch life from the jaws of death and return it to those in her care. Psychologists who studied her case suggested that Genene may have had a version of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder in which a caregiver deliberately makes others sick or causes harm to them in order to draw attention to themselves. But what made Jones's case even more chilling was her lack of remorse. She saw nothing wrong in her actions. In her mind, she was doing the right thing by saving children. After all, they were too young to have any agency, and her interventions were simply a way of taking control of their fragile lives. Genene's case is one of the most unsettling examples of a hero killer in modern criminal history. She wasn't driven by a desire to harm others, but rather by the need to feel important and admired. The psychological profile of a person who would create suffering in order to feel superior is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The investigation into Genene Jones's actions began when Dr. Linda Hawk, a colleague of Genene's, became suspicious. Dr. Hawk noticed the high rate of emergency incidents in the ward, especially those involving children under Jones's care. Eventually, a number of doctors and nurses began to see the pattern as well. Parents of the children who survived the medical emergencies began to speak up, and the hospital administration was forced to take a closer look at Jones's record. Once the investigation was launched, it quickly became apparent that something was terribly wrong. Genene was arrested in 1984 after authorities linked her to the deaths of several children. Evidence from hospital records, as well as testimonies from medical staff and families, painted a damning picture. Jones was charged with the murders of several children and the attempted murders of others. When questioned, Genene was cold and unremorseful. She admitted to many of the deaths, but claimed that her actions were justified, even heroic. Her inability to grasp the gravity of her crimes made her case even more chilling. She had no regrets, no empathy for the children she had killed or the families she had destroyed. Genene Jones was convicted of the murder of 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan in 1985, but the case against her for other murders was less clear-cut due to a lack of concrete evidence. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison, where she remains to this day. Despite the conviction, questions lingered about the full extent of her crimes. Was Genene the cause of the deaths of many more children than the 60 she was suspected of? The hospital she worked for failed to investigate the deaths in a timely manner, which allowed Jones to continue her reign of terror for years. Her case remains a striking example of the dark side of human nature, the need for attention, power, and admiration at any cost. It also sheds light on the vulnerabilities of the healthcare system, where someone like Genene could slip through the cracks and murder dozens of children, all while appearing to be a hero. The legacy of Genene Jones is one of horror and tragedy. She will forever be remembered as the killer nurse of Texas, and her case remains one of the most disturbing in the history of medical crime. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes those who are trusted to care for the vulnerable can be the very ones who cause the most harm. The case of Genene Jones also led to changes in hospital policies and regulations, as healthcare facilities became more aware of the potential for abuse within their walls. Today, her name is synonymous with the terrifying concept of a hero killer, someone who creates suffering in order to gain praise and recognition. For the families of Genene's victims, the nightmare will never end. Their children's deaths were not just the result of illness. They were caused by someone who was supposed to save them. The legacy of Genene Jones serves as a stark warning that sometimes the real danger lies in the most trusted hands. Jones created a real-life horror show to be the star. But our next killer, a hospital orderly, was driven by a need for control, a compulsion to decide who lived and who died. He would earn a chilling nickname for a legacy of dozens of deaths. His victims were critically ill, but they didn't have to die until he decided it was their time. Donald Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, was not a doctor or nurse, but an orderly working in hospitals across Ohio and Kentucky. His role as an orderly allowed him to move freely throughout the hospital, with access to vulnerable patients. Harvey's position afforded him the trust of both patients and staff, making his actions even more chilling. His seemingly innocent job allowed him to carry out his gruesome killings undetected for years. Harvey was well liked by his co-workers, earning the reputation of being a dedicated and hard-working employee. To the outside world, he appeared as someone who simply wanted to help others. But beneath the surface, Harvey was hiding a dark secret. His work in the hospitals, which should have been centered around care and healing, was instead focused on death. He was not just in the business of caring for the sick, he was in the business of murdering them. Harvey's first confirmed victim was an elderly man named James E. Robinson, who died under suspicious circumstances in 1970. However, Harvey's killing spree didn't start and end with Robinson. Over the years, Harvey continued his work, systematically selecting victims and executing his sinister plan. His victims were often those who were already in poor health, including elderly patients, terminally ill individuals, and those in critical care. Harvey would often use his position to gain access to their medical charts, and from there, decide who would be his next target. The method he used varied, making it difficult for the hospital staff to connect the deaths. Harvey would poison his victims using lethal doses of arsenic, suffocate them with pillows, and tamper with medical equipment. In some cases, he would deliberately administer too much oxygen or interrupt their IVs, leading to fatal complications. The deaths appeared to be from natural causes or complications, allowing Harvey to continue his killing spree without suspicion. As the years went on, more and more patients died under Harvey's care. The number of deaths became too numerous to ignore, but due to the circumstances surrounding each case, patients with underlying health problems, no one connected the dots. Each death appeared to be a tragic but ordinary occurrence, and Harvey, always present during the deaths, was seen as a compassionate figure providing comfort to the families of the deceased. Harvey's killing method, though varied, remained consistently effective at evading suspicion. He was a master at creating the illusion of mercy, often staying by his patients' bedsides until the end. In his own twisted mind, he believed that he was helping his victims, ending their suffering and taking away their pain. Harvey claimed that his actions were acts of compassion, but the true motive behind his murders was far darker. Harvey's chilling justification for his actions came when he finally confessed to the killings. Over the course of 17 years, he admitted to murdering at least 37 people, though investigators believe the number could be as high as 50. What made Harvey's case so disturbing was the fact that he genuinely believed he was performing these acts of murder out of mercy. He claimed that he was giving his victims a gift, saving them from their suffering. Psychologists who studied Harvey after his arrest described his motive as one of mercy killing, a concept that many would struggle to comprehend. While some killers are motivated by power, money, or revenge, Harvey's motive was rooted in a warped sense of compassion. He truly believed that his actions were justified and that he was helping the terminally ill patients who were under his care. This delusion made his case even more unsettling, as it illustrated how someone could convince themselves that they were doing good while committing monstrous acts. Harvey's reign of terror finally came to an end in 1987 when he was caught. After years of suspicion and mounting evidence, Harvey was arrested and charged with the murders. The investigation began when a nurse, suspicious of Harvey's actions, alerted authorities. A closer examination of his time at the hospitals revealed a disturbing pattern of deaths that occurred while Harvey was on shift. When confronted with the evidence, Harvey didn't try to deny his actions. Instead, he confessed to the murders, admitting to the details of how he killed his victims and explaining his twisted rationale. He detailed how he would kill in the dead of night, making sure that no one was around to witness the deaths. He claimed that he did it to relieve his victims' suffering, justifying his actions with a chilling sense of calm. During Harvey's trial, the public was stunned by the sheer scale of his crimes. He was convicted of 37 murders, and although he was sentenced to death, his sentence was later commuted to life in prison. The families of his victims were left to process the grief of their loved ones being taken not by illness, but by someone who had been entrusted with their care. The case of Donald Harvey raised significant questions about the healthcare system. It highlighted the vulnerabilities in hospitals, where someone could slip through the cracks and carry out such horrific acts without being caught for years. Harvey's ability to manipulate the system and his patients' trust is a stark reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, especially in a profession where compassion and trust are paramount. The legacy of Donald Harvey is one of horror and tragedy. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of a healthcare worker who turned from healer to killer. It serves as a reminder of the need for vigilance within the healthcare system, ensuring that no one is ever allowed to abuse the power and trust given to them by patients and their families. Harvey's case also serves as a disturbing look into the mind of a killer who believed that his crimes were justified by a warped sense of mercy. Though Harvey is now behind bars, the questions surrounding his killings remain. How many people did he truly kill? Why did the hospitals fail to investigate sooner? The legacy of his actions continues to haunt those who were affected by his crimes, and the chilling reminder that some killers may wear the uniform of a caregiver just waiting for their next victim. Harvey was an orderly who decided to play God, but our next killer was a nurse whose desire to create chaos and then become the hero who saved the day led to a spree of terror at a Veterans Affairs hospital. Behind every crisis at the hospital was a woman in scrubs who created it. Kristen Gilbert was a nurse at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. On the surface, she appeared to be the ideal healthcare professional, compassionate, diligent, and dedicated to her patients. Her colleagues praised her for her ability to connect with the veterans in her care, and her supervisors recognized her as a competent and reliable nurse. What no one knew, however, was that Gilbert was hiding a deadly secret behind her uniform. Gilbert's position in the medical center allowed her to gain access to some of the most vulnerable patients, elderly veterans in critical care, who were often suffering from a variety of ailments. Over time, she became more entrenched in the daily operations of the hospital, but something darker was brewing beneath her professional exterior. Rather than healing her patients, Gilbert would cause them harm, inducing medical emergencies that would leave her colleagues and doctors scrambling to save them. But instead of seeking to heal, Gilbert's ultimate goal was something more sinister: to create chaos and suffering so she could be the one to intervene. And in her twisted mind, be seen as a hero. Gilbert wasn't interested in saving lives. She wanted the attention and admiration that came with playing the role of savior. Kristen Gilbert's first known victims were patients in the critical care unit of the VA hospital. They were elderly, some suffering from terminal illnesses, others simply in need of specialized care. Gilbert used her nursing knowledge to induce sudden medical crises, usually by administering lethal doses of drugs like epinephrine. These emergencies often caused the patient's conditions to rapidly deteriorate, and their deaths appeared to be from natural causes or complications. What made these deaths particularly chilling was Gilbert's ability to manipulate the circumstances. She would be there, ready to save the patients, often performing CPR and other life-saving interventions. But there was always something wrong. The emergency she created was never quite as spontaneous as it seemed. The real victims were the patients who trusted her to care for them, and they would die under circumstances that were never fully investigated at the time. It wasn't until a string of unexplained deaths occurred that suspicion began to rise. Gilbert's colleagues started to notice the pattern. Every time an emergency occurred, she was present. However, the hospital's culture of trust and the complexity of the patient's conditions allowed Gilbert to continue her killings without raising any red flags. As the years went by, the body count in the hospital continued to rise. Patients were experiencing sudden and unexplained medical emergencies, heart attacks, strokes, respiratory failure, all while under Gilbert's care. Yet each time she was involved, there was no clear cause for their sudden collapse. Gilbert's actions went unnoticed for months, even years, as the staff struggled to connect the dots between the deaths. Despite the mounting number of suspicious incidents, the hospital administrators remained slow to act. The deaths were chalked up to the frail health of the patients, and Gilbert continued to work, seemingly unaware that she was under suspicion. Her ability to manipulate the system was masterful. She expertly camouflaged her murderous behavior behind the guise of a dedicated and competent nurse. By the time authorities finally took notice, Kristen Gilbert had already killed 4 people and attempted to kill many more. The victims she left behind were often unaware of the fate that awaited them under her care. It wasn't just the victims' deaths that were horrifying. It was the fact that Gilbert managed to conceal her true motives for so long. What made Kristen Gilbert's case so unsettling wasn't just the murders themselves, but her motive. One that was bizarre and deeply disturbing. Gilbert's killings were not driven by financial gain, revenge, or any traditional serial killer motive. Instead, her crimes were all about attention. Gilbert was dating a security guard at the hospital, and her motive for causing these medical emergencies was simple. She wanted to impress him. In her twisted mind, inducing medical crises and saving patients was a way to gain the attention and admiration of the security guard. She was creating life-threatening situations just to prove how heroic she could be in resolving them. This bizarre need for validation and attention drove her to kill in plain sight, knowing that every time a patient went into crisis, she would be the one to step in and save them. Psychologists who studied Gilbert after her arrest suggested that her need for attention was rooted in deep-seated psychological issues, possibly including narcissism or a desire to feel important and admired. This need for validation became her driving force, and the lives of her patients were merely collateral damage in her quest for praise. The investigation into Kristen Gilbert's actions began when a doctor at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, Dr. Sandra D., noticed the unusual pattern of sudden deaths and near deaths among Gilbert's patients. The doctor's suspicion grew as she began to observe that every time a crisis occurred, Gilbert was present, often performing life-saving interventions. At first, the suspicion seemed unfounded. After all, Gilbert had a reputation for being a good nurse, and the patients were often elderly or in poor health. But as the number of strange deaths continued to rise, Dr. D and several colleagues began to dig deeper. A more thorough review of medical records revealed that many of the emergencies occurred during Gilbert's shifts, and her access to the patient's medications made it easier for her to induce the crises. In 1996, Kristen Gilbert was arrested and charged with the murders of 4 patients and the attempted murder of 2 others. The investigation revealed that her motive had been a combination of narcissism and a desperate need for attention. She had been using her role as a nurse to orchestrate life-threatening situations, all in an attempt to impress her boyfriend and gain the admiration of her colleagues. Kristen Gilbert was convicted of 4 murders and 2 attempted murders. The trial was a shocking spectacle, as the details of her bizarre and disturbing actions came to light. Gilbert's defense team tried to argue that she was mentally ill, but the prosecution successfully made the case that her actions were driven by a calculated need for attention and control. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, the trial left many lingering questions. How many victims had she really killed? Was she the cause of more deaths than the 4 she was convicted of? The number of her victims could never truly be known, as the hospital's failure to investigate sooner allowed her to continue her reign of terror for so long. Gilbert's case raised alarms about the vulnerability of hospital systems and the potential for abuse of trust in healthcare professionals. Her bizarre and narcissistic motives were a chilling reminder of the dangers of someone operating in a position of care with a dark agenda. Kristen Gilbert's legacy is one of disbelief and horror. Her case remains one of the most chilling examples of a killer who operated in plain sight, using her position as a nurse to create chaos and destruction for nothing more than personal gain. She was able to manipulate the system and her colleagues, all while playing the role of a hero in the eyes of those around her. The case of Kristen Gilbert serves as a haunting reminder that some killers do not fit the typical mold. She wasn't motivated by a desire for money or power. She killed for the need to be seen and praised. Her actions also highlighted serious flaws in the way hospitals manage personnel and investigate deaths. As the years pass, Kristen Gilbert's story continues to serve as a terrifying example of how evil can hide behind the most trusted professions. For the families of the victims, the tragedy of their loved ones' deaths was compounded by the knowledge that the person entrusted to save them was the one who caused their suffering. Kristen Gilbert's case remains one of the most disturbing true crime stories in modern history, and it serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for evil to be masked by the facade of heroism. Gilbert craved the spotlight of a rescue, even if she had to create the emergency herself. But our next killer, driven by a deep-seated craving for admiration, would not only kill, but also confess to a chilling number of victims. The stories of Jane Toppan, Genene Jones, Donald Harvey, and Kristen Gilbert reveal a chilling pattern. The hero and the killer can be the same person. They were all driven by a dark desire for control, attention, or pleasure, and they all hid their true nature behind the trusted uniform of a caregiver. But our journey is far from over. In the second part of this series, we will uncover even more unsettling cases. You'll meet a nurse so obsessed with being a hero, he ended dozens of lives. We'll delve into the case of perhaps the most prolific serial killer in American history, who confessed to his crimes but whose true body count may never be known. Join us in part 2 of The Angels of Death, where we will face a chilling question. What happens when the monster is the one you least suspect? If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, Unforeseen Fates. Hitting that notification bell is the best way to ensure you don't miss the next chapter of this series. And in the comments below, let us know which of these first 4 cases you found the most disturbing. Your feedback helps us decide what to cover next.